Okay. I'm here with Professor Law of Birmingham-Southern College, Professor of History, to talk about his upcoming MOOC on the history of terrorism. Professor Law, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great. Can you start off by telling me a little bit about how you got involved in studying terrorism and how you got involved in teaching it?
Sure.
Or teaching about it, I should say, not
Right,
teaching it.
right. It's always good to be careful with the semantics there. So I am by training a professor of Russian history. I majored in Russian in undergraduate and with a master's, and then my PhD is in Russian and European history. While the dissertation I wrote for my PhD it's a good esoteric dissertation topic on early late Imperial Russian and early Soviet education reform projects. So I've gone in a completely different direction. But while I was actually doing my graduate work, I got interested in terrorism, European and Russian terrorism in the 19th century, and did some research and wrote some papers on that. But in particular, I got into the topic because I was studying Russian history, and in a lot of ways, modern terrorism, as we understand it, has its origins in the second half of 19th century Russia. But it wasn't just that, it's that when you then go on to do 20th century Russian Soviet history, of course, you're looking at sort of the other side of the coin, which is violence committed not by sub-state groups, revolutionary terrorism trying to seize power, but violence carried out by the state against its own citizens. And so in looking at Russian history, I found, without really necessarily realizing I was doing it, that I was studying political violence in lots of different forms from lots of different directions. And so even though I never thought of myself as being pursuing terrorism studies, as it's sometimes called, I kind of backed into that. I wrote my master's thesis on the first head of the Soviet secret police, for instance. And then it was 9/11, and I had a lot of the same questions that a lot of people had. I was teaching at a small school in Iowa, a sabbatical replacement before I came to Birmingham-Southern, and September 2001. The attacks happened, the towers came down, so on and so forth, and I had a lot of the same questions that other people had. Who did this? Why did they do it? What were they hoping to achieve? But I already had something of a background to think about it, not from the standpoint of the Middle East, Islamism, jihadism, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, but from the standpoint of terrorism from the historical perspective. And so I started thinking about it more, and the next year, so I guess in 2002, I offered a course on the history of terrorism, and I've kept doing that since. So I've been teaching the course for about 12 years or so, I guess, probably about once a year, and then from there, it has gained momentum. I was looking around for a textbook to offer to have my students buy and use, and I realized there was no good textbook on the history of terrorism. And in about 2006 or so, a publisher approached me, and that turned into an opportunity to write a textbook on a survey history of terrorism, which I did, and that came out in 2009. I'm actually working on the second edition of that, which will come out in a year or two. I'm an editor of a big volume reference work by Routledge, so even though I'm still sort of in my DNA a Russian historian for the last decade, it's really been terrorism studies and sort of working outward from Russia and Europe that has occupied my thinking the most, I'd say. I'm sorry, that was a very long explanation to get up to the present.
No, that's very helpful. And how much interest was there in your course when you offered it? Obviously, with 9/11, I'm sure it got a lot of attention, but was there a lot of interest in the course, and did that grow over time?
It's definitely grown over time. I had, I don't know, 10 students or so that first term. This was a small liberal arts college, in some ways similar to Birmingham-Southern, small classes and such. But whenever I teach the course, it closes out. I've increasingly been sought out as a speaker on the subject. Media outlets looking for experts, overseeing student theses, things of that sort at Southern. No, it's a topic obviously that people have tremendous interest in, even when they don't necessarily know what questions to ask, particularly when they find out that I'm an historian and not somebody who's directly
Sure.
involved in policy, for instance.
Can you articulate one or two things that you see as the most common or most salient things that students learn after going through the course?
Right. So again, I'm an historian, so I come at this from a humanities standpoint, whereas probably most people who work on terrorism studies come at it from the social sciences perspective. So it's a lot more focused on the present. It's a lot more geared toward quantifiable analysis, a lot more geared toward sort of policy conclusions. And that usually tends to come at terrorism from sort of a list of criteria. If it fits these criteria, then it's terrorism, and we can try to make sense of it as such. Coming at it from the humanities perspective, I don't think about terrorism as a criteria, as a checklist. I'm looking at really the historical evolution of our understanding of terrorism. So it's driven, as the historian would think of it, by context. That people in different times and different places understood terrorism in different ways, used it as a different kind of tactic and strategy towards different ends, and that societies made sense of it in different ways. So I guess that's probably the most important thing that students come away is that there are not it's not a simple checklist of features, and that it depends on time and place. It's context driven. Terrorism is old, but terrorism is something dynamic that has changed over time, and so probably a couple other things that are the most salient, the things that they come away with, it's really the understanding of terrorism that began to emerge in the 19th century, which is that terrorism is symbolic violence. And that's, if people press me, what's my definition of terrorism? That's what I go to. Mm-hmm. It's symbolic violence, even sometimes you could say theatrical violence, which isn't to say that there isn't real blood, real casualties, real people don't die. They obviously do. But the idea behind terrorism as a tactic, and that's a very important idea, it's not an ideology, it's a tactic, is that terrorism is used to achieve an aim, a goal indirectly. And so that's something that distinguishes it from war, for instance. Those who use terrorism don't try to achieve their aims by eliminating the enemy or seizing territory. If they had the army to do that, they wouldn't be using they wouldn't be using terrorism. They would be waging conventional war. Or they don't. If they could do it through the election, through the electoral system in a democracy, they would change the system that way. And so it's a tactic that achieves results indirectly by using violence that has a symbolic element, that provokes people to act in a certain way, that intimidates them, that changes people's behavior, so that through the behavior of a larger part of the society, people help the terrorists essentially achieve their aims, or at least that's the goal. So terrorism can be used can be used to change the behavior of a government, change the behavior of civilians, but it can also be used, you can almost sort of say positively, to inspire followers, to help shape a movement, to bring people together. So in that sense, it can be used positively and negatively. We tend to think of terrorism only as terrorizing the enemy, but it can also be used, it can have a symbolic element for those who are disposed to look at the violence against an enemy positively, if that makes sense.
Okay. I think so. You're saying that it's somehow related to violence that has a symbolic aspect to it that is purposely designed to affect the psychology of certain groups of people outside of the direct victims.
Exactly. So the goal isn't necessarily to kill a particular victim, but by inflicting harm on them, to have that resonate with a much broader audience. And that's a word I always use with my students: audience. Think about what's the audience of the violent act.
Well, what about something like self-immolation, where the violence is against oneself? Does that count as terrorism?
Well, that's a good one. I've not heard that one before. It connects in interesting ways to terrorist violence. There's that idea of martyrdom, of sacrifice, that one is trying to sway a broad population through a symbolic act. But I'd probably, again, I'm more interested in what do other people call terrorism? What does that reflect about? What does that say about how we've come to use the term? In this case, I would probably say in general it's not, because the intent isn't, there is no audience, there is no population that is being intimidated by that violence, since the only victim is oneself. That's an interesting question.
Okay. Yeah. So you talked about the history a little bit. I mean, let's get into that. I know you mentioned that the definition of terrorism isn't so cut and dried, and it changes over time, and it changes depending on the context. But what are some of the earliest examples of terrorism, and what are the significant epochs or modes of terrorism throughout history that you talk about?
Sure. Well, I start in the ancient world. I start with the Greeks and the Romans and the Hebrews. For them, it's anachronistic. It's not really accurate to use the word terrorism, because that wasn't a concept that they had. And so if that's not something that they understood, it's out of place for us to impose that meaning on them. Up until basically the 18th century, what we see that is somewhat similar to terrorism today is what was called, in the ancient and medieval world, tyrannicide, which was the killing of a tyrant who was deemed an illegitimate ruler. And it's fundamentally different from what we think of as terrorism today, because it wasn't symbolic. The idea was like Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is sort of the classic case of tyrannicide in the ancient world. Here is somebody who aspires to be a king, to upend the traditional order. We need to kill him, but only him. And the idea is to restore politics as it should be. Now, the transition from tyrannicide in the ancient and medieval world to what we think of as terrorism today is the 18th century. In particular, it's the French Revolution, when, under the influence of the Enlightenment, we see the impact of this in the American Revolution, of course, as well. The idea of tyranny changed. In the ancient and the medieval world, the idea was that one person is a tyrant. Starting in the really earlier, but really crystallizing in the 18th century, the idea was that that tyranny was a system, and that you couldn't change that system by killing just one person. You had to transform the system, and the idea wasn't to return to some sort of perfect pre-tyrannical pre-tyranny situation, but to create something better. And so actually, the first time that we see the word terrorist used is in the French Revolution, and they embraced it as a positive term. The Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins during the French Revolution, they said, we are terrorists, and terror is a good thing. It's justice. We're using terror to eliminate our enemies and basically influence the behavior of everyone and get rid of tyranny and establish a new system. So it's really interesting that the first time we see the word terrorist used, it's positive, which is odd for most people thinking about terrorism today, and it was applied to the state. The terrorists weren't some sort of conspiratorial group trying to seize power. It was the state, the revolutionary state, already in power, using terror to solidify its hold on power and to transform the system. So if you think of terrorism as sort of as a modern phenomenon, we're really talking about something that's about 200, 2.25 centuries old. There are people that we could point to as pre-modern terrorists, and one of the great examples is a group called the Sicarii in the 1st century AD. So we're talking just a generation after the death of Jesus, in Palestine, Judea, which was a Roman province, and this band of Jewish freedom fighters started killing local notables, interestingly enough, Jewish notables who they saw as the puppets of the Romans. And the idea was to provoke a Roman reaction. And sure enough, the Sicarii, they started assassinating and kidnapping local Jewish officials, and they got the Romans so angry that the Romans invaded. They sent several legions to Judea to put down this revolt, and the Sicarii got what they wanted, in the sense that they wanted to provoke a Roman reaction, because the Sicarii imagined, that they understood most Jews in Judea, they're sitting on the sidelines. They're bystanders. They don't want to get involved they don't want to put themselves on the line to win freedom for Judea. They said, if we can get the Romans to invade, everybody has to pick sides. And that's what happened. The Romans invaded, and it's called the Jewish War, the Jewish-Roman War. The problem, of course, was for the Sicarii is that the Romans were successful. They destroyed the Second Temple. They scattered the Jews. They imposed direct rule over Judea. And the thing is, this is looking at the Sicarii almost 2,000 years ago. It's how a lot of terrorist groups operate in the 20th century, which is that they try to provoke a crackdown, a brutal crackdown that they hope will radicalize people who sit on the sidelines and get everyone involved, because those who use terrorism often imagine that we're the only ones who are willing to use violence. But if we could, but we've got lots of passive supporters. If we can get the masses to wake up, they'll all be on our side, and then we've got the numbers on our side, and then we can win, not by using conspiratorial violence, but we can win through conventional war or guerrilla war, or influence the enemy because of our massive numbers. And this is 2,000 years ago. The thing about it, though, is that nobody really used that strategy again until the 20th century, so they were really ahead of their time. But there's one really good source in particular, and you can see how they did it. And they didn't call themselves terrorists, of course, but it fits what we think of terrorism from the 20th century perspective.
I mean, that sounds like the plot of half the James Bond movies, where the enemy is trying to do something through subterfuge to provoke two stalemated sides into some cataclysm. That does resonate.
The way that really emerged as sort of the signature strategy of those who used terrorism in the 1950s, particularly in Algeria, where Algeria nationalists were fighting for a free Algeria to achieve independence from the French, who possessed Algeria as a colonial possession. And so these they were the FLN, the National Liberation Front. They used violence to try basically to get the French to respond in such a brutal fashion that they would radicalize the masses, the native Algerians, who then would, really kind of see starkly, we either continue to live under the heel of the French, who are now nakedly, overtly brutal, or we back this rebel group who are actually pretty violent themselves, but we back them as the sort of the legitimate voices of our people. And that's become, in a lot of ways, over the last 50, 60 years, sort of the signature strategy of a lot of terrorist groups, is to, like you said, you can see them in movies. Yeah.
So you're almost suggesting, though, that terrorists are game strategists in some sense. They're looking at the chess moves, and they're trying to bank on certain effects happening in the future.
Absolutely. One of my very basic assertions, and I really don't, it's not even something I necessarily argue, it's actually just simply one of my assumptions. It's where I begin, which is that terrorism is a rational choice. Now, it's one made within certain contexts that would appear strange to a lot of viewers, but violence can be used as a rational choice in lots of contexts by lots of people, and terrorism it's a tactic, it's a weapon, and it's part of a larger strategy, and people consciously use it seeking particular results. Now, of course, another important point is that pretty typically terrorism is a weapon of the weak. It's an act of desperation used by those who see that they don't have other good tactics or strategies to use to achieve what they want, some sort of political change. But in that sense, it then becomes a conscious choice, which isn't to say it's not a choice sometimes made by the mentally unbalanced or the deranged, or the sociopathically violent. But it's in that sense a choice, and one of the real problems and one of I think a fatal misstep that people often make is to think of terrorism as a kind of insanity. Well, the people who use that must be crazy, because they could only do that if they were insane. Yeah. Well, the moment you do that, you've completely cut yourself off from understanding why people choose to use it and what they hope to achieve with it. Which isn't to say that you sympathize with their choices, but understanding is important.
Sure, and this is great, Professor. This is exactly the line of thinking that your points are raising with me. One of the questions I was going to ask is, what are the similarities or differences between a terrorist organization and a cult? And I think that you hit upon one of those just now, but along the rationality lines. But what are your thoughts? Is there some overlap there?
Oh, sure. I mean, I would not use the word cult in any sort of clinical way. I guess I would use the word cult in a pretty expansive way. I think a lot of political movements have cultish elements to them, in that they create it's a kind of an alternative reality, which has an internal logically consistency. That says, this is the position we're in, these are the people who are responsible, this is the enemy who does it to us, this is the way out. It often, of course, involves some sort of charismatic leader who promises some sort of complete resolution to the problem through strange means. So yeah, I think you can. That's a framework you could use in some instances to make sense of terrorist groups. Again, I think it's important to keep in mind the element of rational choice, and I think one of the places where we can do that is to distinguish between those who lead terrorist organizations and those who join and become followers within terrorist organizations. And I think a great place we can see that is with jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda, so on and so forth. I think in a lot of ways, like a figure like Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, his lieutenant, who's now the leader of Al-Qaeda, they are master manipulators. I think bin Laden and al-Zawahiri, I mean, they have believed their own propaganda. They imagine that they're trying to recreate the caliphate. They're trying to impose some sort of Islamic utopia. They've conflated the 11th, 12th century and the present, so that Israel is a crusader kingdom. But at the same time, somebody like a bin Laden, he's thinking, or he was, thinking very clearly about cause and effect. What would be the impact of this act of violence? In particular, so that he could recruit more followers and grow his organization. And that's a very different way of thinking about the purpose of Al-Qaeda as opposed to some of those who might have joined and become members of missions, suicide bombers, 9/11, and so on and so forth, who were probably first and foremost not thinking about specific political results, but were thinking in terms of martyrdom, sacrifice, sacramental violence, all this sort of thing. Whereas for bin Laden, he's in some ways, he was sort of a classic geopolitical thinker. So I think that's one place where you can and I think actually, cults can kind of work as well as a framework there in some ways, when we see such a difference between leaders and followers and the role of manipulation. But of course, a lot of cult leaders, a lot of terrorists believe their own propaganda and become enmeshed in an alternative world that is, in that sense, perhaps not terribly rational.
Sure. Now, throughout history, has it been the case that terrorist organizations, or at least big terrorist organizations, have had a charismatic leader? Does that appear to be a necessary ingredient?
Many of them have had one, but that's certainly not necessarily the case. There have been plenty of groups that had sort of collective leadership, who could stand the loss of this or that particular leader and keep on going. There have been a lot of terrorist movements that, to use a phrase from the 1980s that became big, leaderless resistance. Terrorist violence carried out by small, really kind of independent cells that didn't necessarily even belong to a larger organization. This is the case with a lot of today, and for the last couple of decades, that sort of the militia violence in the United States. Timothy McVeigh is a great example, and a lot sort of associated with hate groups, white supremacist groups. Another great example is after the American Civil War, during the period of Reconstruction. The most successful terrorist organization, certainly in American history, and one of the most successful terrorist organizations in the history of terrorism, is the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, which, to call it that, suggests that it was a single organization that was centrally organized, as a party with branches and blah blah blah. In the late 60s and the 70s, when the Klan was operating, most of that violence was carried out locally, regionally, and there was an imperial grand wizard for a while in the late 60s, 1860s, Nathan Bedford Forrest.
But he was anonymous.
Well, I mean, people knew who he was, and he actually then disavowed himself because he didn't want to be the face of it and get in trouble for what all these others were doing. Of course, he was himself a horrible racist and was happy what they were doing to free blacks and the whites who supported them. But so that's a great example of a terrorist movement that really was diffuse over a large area, didn't need a particular leader to make it work, and it was ultimately successful. I mean, the terrorists won. That's why we got Jim Crow and so on and so forth for half a century.
I see. Okay, Professor, you talked about, or you mentioned that there is some roots of modern terrorism or modern terrorist practice in Russia or the Soviet Union. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. In a lot of ways, terrorism, as we imagine it today, these cells engaged in conspiratorial violence, trying to overthrow a system, has its roots in second half of the 19th century. In particular, there was a group called Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will, and it was a group. There might have been maybe 500 members of it in the late 1870s they had given up on the idea of peaceful change. They said the only way we're going to emancipate the people, to bring about transformation of Russia, is through violence. Because the state is so authoritarian, there's no peaceful way to change. And they played around with assassination of officials and provisional governors and military officials and so on and so forth. And eventually they said, no, let's go big or go home, as we would say now. Let's assassinate the Tsar, the monarch of Russia. And they were ultimately successful in March 1881 in assassinating Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia. They imagined that this violence would be understood as a symbolic act, that it would empower the people, that it would spark a revolution which would lead then to the masses rising up and liberating themselves. Of course, that didn't happen. Alexander II was assassinated. His son became, Alexander III became the new Tsar of Russia and brutally cracked down on all the terrorist organizations and drove them underground, basically, for a generation. But we see with them a lot of what we see with terrorist organizations of the 20th century, this conspiratorial planning and plotting, living life in the underground, committed to the idea of the professional revolutionary who lives a life of pseudonyms with safe houses and passwords and secret printing presses and so on and so forth. And it wasn't just that they were trying to make a revolution. They were trying to use symbolic acts of violence against the Tsar and other officials to spark a mass revolution. A generation later in Russia, the first decade of the 20th century, we see the transition to what we think of really today as terrorist violence, which was terrorism used on a massive scale against civilians, throwing bombs in cafes, shooting random people on the street, trying to spread this sense of chaos and disorder to unhinge everyone. That had started a little bit later, a little bit earlier in Europe, but it really was raised to a whole new level in Russia early in the 20th century. So I guess this is sort of, again, how I kind of got into terrorism, by looking at this stuff in the specifically Russian context, figuring out what was happening there, beginning to understand how these patterns were reproduced in other places, how some of these movements were actually studied. The people the group that assassinated Alexander II, they were studied by revolutionary terrorist organizations all over the place. Europe, like the early Irish Republican Army. Michael Collins in the 1910s and 1920s studied what was called the Russian method of using assassination and conspiratorial violence to achieve political change.
I see. Interesting. Professor, let me ask you about the discourse that we hear today in American politics and among the American public. How well do you think the discourse is today around the topic of terrorism? How nuanced, how sophisticated, how competent is it relative to what it should be?
Oh, it's horrible. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. It is not. We do ourselves a horrible disservice. And of course, and part of the problem goes back to what I said earlier, which is that we imagine that those who use terrorism are insane. They are irrational. They're fundamentally crazy. We shouldn't even try to understand them because we sully ourselves by trying to make sense of them, because then we sympathize with them, so on and so forth. I mean, we have been, and this goes back to the 19th century. It's not just those who engage in terrorism who seek to manipulate using it. It's that the victims, the societies, political leaders use terrorism, sometimes unconsciously, often very consciously, to achieve results. There's lots and lots of fear mongering that goes on. There are great examples of this going back to the 19th century. In the 1870s, a couple anarchists tried to assassinate Kaiser Wilhelm I, the German emperor. And they were a couple of anarchists. And Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, knew that these were anarchists and that they were isolated, that there were very few of them. And he deliberately stoked fear about them, so much so that the German parliament passed a whole series of laws that were used to crack down on the socialist movement. And so Bismarck deliberately used fear of terrorism, channeled it in politically useful directions, and we see that right down to the present. We certainly see that with like Putin, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. It's horrible to say this, but the war in Chechnya and Chechen terrorism has been incredibly useful politically to Putin to establish himself as a strong man, to gain support for his tactics, and to go after political enemies, to suppress dissent, to eliminate a lot of the free press, so on and so forth. He wasn't behind Chechen acts of political violence, but he made sure all Chechen moderates were destroyed, so that there was nobody to negotiate with, so that all Chechens could be politically usefully described as terrorists and bandits. We see that happen all the time. So the discourse that surrounds terrorism does us little good. Of course, we create this ourselves. Our entertainment does this. Just as like you said earlier, James Bond movies. The Cold War supplied all the tropes that were used over and over again during the Cold War, during James Bond movies. Whatever the plot really was, have a Soviet agent, have the evil Russians behind everything. Well, now it's terrorism. I mean, look at how often we how many action thrillers today, even if it's not really about terrorism, perhaps, but the bad guy is a terrorist, and it becomes such a convenient trope because we all know that the terrorist is the bad guy and that they act in certain ways, even though it's completely ahistorical and makes no sense.
Let me ask you about this, Professor. There does seem to be a strand of discourse where people make this sort of go along these lines of thinking, where they say, well, terrorism is a tactic that is resorted to by people who feel powerless and are being dominated by Western countries and so on, and so this is the only way they can express themselves. And if they had better, economic conditions, or if the West was more politically fair, then all this wouldn't be necessary. What's your take on that line of reasoning?
Well, I always want to be very clear and say that those who use terrorism, those particularly these days, those who deliberately target civilians who are otherwise uninvolved to make a political point, I mean, that's utterly despicable. And I would specifically say it is immoral to engage in that kind of violence. But at the same time, we need to understand, and they do that as an act of free will, I guess we could say. At the same time, we need to understand how states and societies enable that, how they provide fertile ground to those who want to use terrorism as a brand of political violence. And a great example, of course, is the Iraq War in 2003. There was no relationship between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. There was no relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Iraq was not part of a war on terror until we invaded, until we had this absurd plan for the occupation. We created a vacuum in Iraq by getting rid of military and political authorities. We deliberately contributed to the chaos. And not surprisingly, given what was going on, that vacuum was filled by radical Islamists and jihadists who took that opportunity to open a new front, who opened a front in the war on terror against the United States. So in that sense, the United States was an enabler. I mean, that's a very specific example. To go back to your broader question of, is terrorism a kind of blowback? Is it payback to the United States and Western powers? That's a grand thesis that I would shy away from. A grand argument that I would shy away from making, but yeah, and I try to be, as I guess I would say, non-judgmental when trying to understand terrorism as a phenomenon. But it is very clear that in the case of, like Algeria, the French in Algeria during the Algerian War of Independence, the French, particularly the European settlers in Algeria, deliberately chose to behave in a way that in the end encouraged political violence by the dispossessed. And particularly in that they made sure that they got rid of all moderate, they shut down any sort of negotiation that could have led to a moderation of France and France's role in Algeria, and so locals were left to either, again, as I said before, to submit to France or to follow radicals. Again, though, the radical, the FLN that used terrorism in Algeria, they themselves went after all moderate nationalists who might have wanted to negotiate with France, also doing their part to make sure that Algerians had no moderate leaders who could have led them towards some sort of middle ground. That's I think this would be the broader point that I would make, is that humans are not a naturally peaceful species. We are violent, and most of the history of humanity is not a history of peace and lack of conflict. That's what's unusual. The history of humanity is a history of conflict, and that we always get sucked into these cycles of tit-for-tat violence and contexts which which encourage more violence. And in some ways, in the last 2 centuries, terrorism has become one of the signature forms of violence that ends up being used in these struggles. So if we're going to make some sort of argument about the United States getting some sort of payback for its behavior in the Middle East, so on and so forth, this is a larger conversation about not just terrorism, I would say then.
I see. Well, let me ask you this, Professor. Let's say maybe one of your wishes came true, and discourse in the American public arena all of a sudden became much more sophisticated, understanding, and nuanced about terrorism and terrorists.
Right. What would that look?
Yeah. What difference do you think that would actually make?
Sure. Well, that's important, and I will be right up front and say I'm lucky. I'm an academic. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not directly crafting policies about how we define terrorism at the federal level, how we go after, how we employ counterterrorism, so on and so forth. I'm trying to get people to ask better questions. So for me, it's education is a path to a better way to deal with terrorism. As an academic, that makes perfect sense. One issue that I see we face is, I guess you could say, sort of the psychology of risk assessment, the psychology of threat assessment. And we see this, and it obviously happens outside of terrorism. You ask most people, what is safer, to travel by car or to travel by plane? And most people, they don't even think about it. They say, obviously, planes are much more dangerous. Well, it's because, when a plane goes down, hundreds of people die. But actually, if you look at, and it's covered relentlessly in the media, the problems happen rarely, but when they happen, they're catastrophic. So we understand this as being a much more dangerous way to travel. Whereas if you actually look at, fatalities per million miles traveled, cars are death traps. Terrorism, of course, figures into this because people think of war as natural, conflict as natural, and that when conflict happens, we think it's appropriate. We accept casualties in the thousands. Yet terrorist actions, in most instances, produce no fatalities or small handfuls of fatalities, but the impact on how we think is extraordinary because we attach a whole different, we think of that as a different kind of category of violence. In a sense, of course, that's what terrorists plan on. Those who use terrorism plan on is that I can cause a handful of casualties here and look at the ripple effect. I can kill 5 people and I can get the attention of 100 million people, and I can intimidate them with a $5,000 bomb, something I couldn't do if I was acting in the political process, for instance, or trying to wage conventional war. So it's that psychological risk assessment.
Okay.
Which is to say, and this is a horrible suggestion to make, but in a sense, we need to come to understand that terrorism is a fact of life in the 21st century. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, despite President George Bush's inflated rhetoric during the War on Terror that we're going to destroy all terrorist groups with a global reach. We can eradicate this source of evil. Well, that's preposterous. Of course not. Terrorism's a tactic. You can't get rid of it. It's here. What we can do, though, is come to understand its impact, its role, be better at thinking about the consequences of terrorist acts, and think about better responses to it. When somebody dies in a car accident, we don't wage a war on traffic fatalities. We unfortunately accept it. The better way to think about it is to think about incremental changes that change our behavior, change our reaction, change the circumstances, so on and so forth. In a sense, we need to think about terrorism in that way, and think about it less from a standpoint of fear, and so come up with better questions to ask. Not how do we eliminate these groups, but how do we cut these groups off from their recruits so that in time they slowly die? We can't harden all targets. Of course, that's what we did after 9/11. We created entire new bureaucracies that were solely geared toward dealing with plane travel. Well, we didn't think about all the other ways that we were vulnerable to terrorism that would have been much, much easier to guard against, or we could have used that money in other more intelligent ways. But the problem, of course, is that when a terrorist attack happens, people they freak out, and particularly they want their government to do something now, immediately, show us action, even if it's wrong, even if it's counterproductive, do something. And that is an ill-informed, irrational way of behaving. It's also, of course, very human, and it's what terrorists count
on. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor, just a couple more questions here. I know we're approaching the end of our time, but I'm curious. Why did you choose to expand your course into a MOOC? How did you find out about that, and how did you go about doing it?
Yeah, this is a interesting story. I don't think I wouldn't have come up with this on my own. That idea very much came from the administration at Birmingham-Southern College, who encouraged me to think about doing this, in particular from our president, General Krulak, Charles Krulak, who is the president of a small, pretty traditional liberal arts college in Birmingham, and he also happens to be the retired commandant of the Marine Corps. He was the commandant of the Marine Corps for the second half of the 90s, basically Bill Clinton's second term. And so he thought about it on the one hand, and the administration did as well, that this is education in the great liberal arts tradition, in the sense that you take an expert with a particular subject expertise, and you encourage people, as many people as possible, to get involved. Take in a MOOC, for instance, encourage them to think about lifelong education, thinking about a topic from a different perspective, bring history to bear on something that we think about as simply a contemporary problem. So in some ways, it's sort of even though it's not a small liberal arts classroom with a lot of those elements, it still makes sense in terms of, I think, Birmingham Southern's liberal arts tradition. On the other hand, because he has connections, because he is thinking about real-world applications of this kind of expertise, General Krulak said, let's put together this MOOC, and let's try to get people watching this MOOC, taking this course, who could use this knowledge, who could use this expertise, who could then ask better questions and be in a position to actually apply this. So we're certainly interested in getting that kind of general audience to take this MOOC. We're certainly interested in people who are taking it, who are retirees, who are simply interested in this as a topic because it's a contemporary issue, whatever it might be. But we're also very interested in getting people involved who come from law enforcement, government service, military, so on and so forth, who would be interested in taking this, who are in a position to use this information and actually do something with it. And so, from that standpoint, we're also hoping that we get, it's a classic MOOC in the sense that it is open to all, available to all. There's no, you have to buy books or whatever. All the materials are available through the MOOC. We're going to make available a certificate of completion for those who complete it, who watch all the lectures, who take all the quizzes, who write the essays, and all that sort of good stuff, and pay to get a certificate. That would essentially work sort of as a continuing education credit, but particularly for people in the military or for government service who could put this in a portfolio that would show that they've acquired some competence in this field when they're either for for a military promotion or for a civil government civil promotion as well.
How are you letting those folks know about this MOOC?
Well, a lot of that is through General Krulak's personal connections, through his connections with the service academies, through all the various war colleges, his connections through Homeland Security, so on and so forth. And so that's something that is, one of the things that people ask me is, so is this the way of the future? Is this what small liberal arts colleges have to do in the future to be relevant? And I say this is related to our mission, which is education, and education for as many people as we can get involved in this. I think it also shows off, though, what I do in the classroom, but it also it's a niche for us. It's something that we have. I have sort of a unique specialty, and we have a president with a unique set of connections that really come together quite nicely. So it's not as if we're chucking the small classroom where we teach 15 or 20 or 30 students centered around discussion for online education. This works hand in hand with what we're doing. It's different from what we're doing, but it's a continuation of that mission, because we have some unique things at play here. Sure,
that makes sense. It's a unique opportunity. And how's the process of logistics of actually? I believe you're on the Course Sites platform. Is that right? How's the process of logistics of actually executing the MOOC? How much work is it, and so forth?
It's more work than I thought it would be. I have been working on it very intensively for the last couple of months, recording the lectures, developing, finding all the images, getting all the open source readings, putting together the quizzes, so on and so forth. So for those who think that just like the internet, well, you just put it out there, it's all free, and people just watch it. Well, obviously that's not how it works. That's not how the internet works these days. If you want to do it well, it requires a lot of resources. We're basically working with a producer who's coordinating all of our work with Course Sites. They found a videographer, the editor for the lectures. They found an instructional technologist who's building the website. So, I mean, I'm getting just a small insight into what the credits at the end of a movie, why they're so damn long, because I can see that even this MOOC, even just for a couple of weeks of taping, of shooting these video lectures, there are more people involved in it than I would have thought before. So, to do the MOOC well, it takes a real commitment of time and resources and expertise, both in terms of the content and in terms of the logistics of making it work. So I would, for anybody who's thinking about plunging into MOOCdom, I would encourage them to think about what they're doing and make sure that they have the resources, make sure they have the expertise to do it in a way that does justice to the topic. I'm hardly saying something.
Well, excellent, Professor. Thank you. No, but it's good to get the additional perspectives. That is consistent with what I've heard.
I bet, yeah.
Professor, those are all the questions that I had, and thank you very much for talking about this very, very interesting topic. It sounds like it's a big need in the public's way of thinking to understand this a little bit further, because it is a fact of modern life. One real quick question, since you are a specialist in Russian political history and such, what are your quick thoughts on the issues going on in the Crimea right now?
Oh, yeah, that's a whole nother big topic. I actually spent about 4 months living in Ukraine during a sabbatical. I got a Fulbright to spend 4 months in Odessa, which is in the southwest corner of Ukraine. We and my family, we spent a week traveling around Crimea. We were in Yalta and Sevastopol and Simferopol and so on and so forth. I think the most important thing to keep in mind here is from the Russian side that Putin has gone all in. He's primarily thinking about a domestic audience here. He's not particularly susceptible to being to changing his behavior by being expelled from the G8, because what he's done in Ukraine has driven his poll numbers up. He's up to 75% of the Russian public approves of his leadership. And so this is, and there's a pattern here with what he did in, following on the heels of what he did in Georgia, in the Northern Caucasus back in 2008 as well. And this is really troubling for those other parts of the former Soviet Union that are now independent countries that have large ethnic Russian populations in Kazakhstan and the Baltics, for instance. The other thing from the Ukrainian perspective that needs to be remembered is that I think in the Western press too much is made of the ethnic and particularly the linguistic divide in Ukraine, in the north and the east. The east and the south, it's dominated by Russian speakers. The west and the north, it's dominated by Ukrainian speakers. That's not necessarily the same thing as ethnic Russians or Ukrainians. The thing is, most of the Ukrainians that I talk to, particularly, including the ones, I guess I would say, who are Russian speakers, they think of themselves as Ukrainian. Even if they're ethnically Russian and they speak Russian at home and in public, they understand what it means to be citizens of Ukraine. So it is a divided country in important ways, politically, because of its history and so on and so forth. But most Ukrainians have a sense of what Ukraine is, and I think that sense of internal division is really overplayed in the West.
So how do you think they will respond then? How do you think the Ukraine will respond?
Well, the worst case scenario is if Russia moves into the Russian military moves into eastern Ukraine, which is the area dominated by ethnic Russians. And I think if that were to happen, the Ukrainian military would fight back. I think most Ukrainians would rally around the blue and yellow of the Ukrainian flag and fight back. I think in the near term, the big question is what happens with the May 25th elections, and the hope there is that there are viable ethnic Russian candidates regionally and nationally, that there are viable Russian-speaking candidates, that the elections are free and open, that there is a robust debate in the Ukrainian press, which is far more free and far more independent than what we see in Russia. And the hope there is that Ukrainians the Ukrainians see that they need to decide these matters for themselves and ignore the Russian propaganda that's being pumped into the eastern part of the country, in particular about neo-fascists and Ukrainian radical nationalists and so on and so forth who are hijacking the country. So that's my hope. What then Russia does, we'll see.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. And once again, I'm speaking with Professor Randy Law, Professor of History at University of Birmingham-Southern College, and most particularly about your upcoming MOOC on the history of terrorism. Professor, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, it was enjoyable to get to talk to you, and thanks for the opportunity.